She was beheaded before her 20th birthday. Her name was Catherine Howard. They told her to be silent. She did not obey quietly, and for that they wrote an ending. In the sprawling, chaotic household of the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, a young girl named Catherine Howard began her education. This was not a home built on affection, but a finishing school for the well-born, a place where the daughters of the aristocracy were polished like silver before being placed on the marriage market. Here, under the ambivalent eye of her step-grandmother, Agnes Howard, Catherine learned her first and most enduring lesson. She was a Howard, a name that carried the weight of ambition and the expectation of duty. And in the world of the Howards, a woman's primary duty was clear. Catherine was raised to obey men. Her value was tied not to her own mind or spirit, but to her deference. She was taught to be a mirror, reflecting the desires and commands of the powerful men who would shape her destiny. Her tutors, her powerful uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and one day, a king. The lessons were constant, delivered not just by tutors, but by the very air she breathed. They came disguised as kindness, wrapped in the language of protection. A governess would adjust her posture, not for her comfort, but for her presentation. Older girls, veterans of the system, would share advice on how to please, how to charm, how to secure a favourable glance. Instruction sounded like care. It felt like control. Every lesson in music, dance or French was designed to increase her marriage value. Every warning about her conduct was a reminder that her reputation was a fragile commodity, owned and managed by her family. The Duchess's household was famously lax in its direct supervision, a crowded warren of over 100 young people. But this was not freedom. It was an environment where the rules were enforced not by a single authority, but by the collective, competitive gaze of everyone around her. It was a gilded cage where the bars were made of expectation. Day after day, the curriculum was drilled into her. It was a pedagogy of performance. Her lessons were obedience, repetition, and quiet smiles. She learned to walk with a grace that drew the eye, but did not challenge. She learned to speak with a wit that entertained, but did not threaten. And she learned to smile, a currency of its own, to be spent wisely to appease, to deflect, to survive. Each curtsy was a physical manifestation of submission, each rehearsed phrase a surrender of her own voice. This was the education of a Tudor noblewoman, not to build a mind, but to shape a tool for dynastic ambition. The architecture of her world was an extension of this teaching. Every corridor had its designated purpose, every room its designated occupants. Doors taught her the shape of limits. They defined where she could and could not go, who had access to her, and from whom she was barred. A locked door was a statement of power. An open door was an invitation, but rarely one she could refuse. She learned to read the meaning in the turn of a handle, the sound of a bolt sliding home. These were the physical boundaries that mirrored the invisible walls being built around her will. In rooms where authority laughed, she learned silence, a survival. The boisterous confidence of powerful men, her uncle, his allies, visiting dignitaries, filled every space. Their jokes were not for her to understand, their decisions not for her to question. Her role was to be present, but invisible, a decorative piece of Howard property. To speak out of turn was to risk wrath. To show displeasure was to be difficult. Silence became her shield, a quiet refusal to offer up any more of herself than was absolutely required. She observed, she listened, and she learned that the most dangerous thing a woman could possess was an opinion. She was a pawn in a game she had not been taught the rules to, only her role within it. The courtly world was a web of patronage and power, and her family, the Howards, were master spiders. Value was measured in alliances, not in girlhood. Her laughter, her beauty, her very existence were assets to be leveraged for the family's gain. A potential marriage for Catherine was not about her happiness. It was a strategic move, a way to secure favour, land or influence. Her childhood was not a time of innocent discovery, but a period of grooming for this transactional future. Control was everywhere, symbolised by the simple heavy weight of metal. Keys always hung from someone else's waist. The steward held the keys to the larder, the guards to the gates, the Duchess to the jewel coffers. Catherine owned nothing, controlled nothing. Her movements, her possessions, her very time were subject to the will of those who held the keys. This lack of ownership was a constant physical reminder of her place in the hierarchy. The older girls, themselves products of the same system, became its most effective enforcers. They had learned the script and now taught it to the newcomers. Older girls named the rules. Be pleasing, be pretty, be still. Be pleasing to the men who hold power. Be pretty, for your face is your fortune. Be still, for a quiet woman is a safe woman. It was a sorority of survival, where conformity was the price of admission. Yet even in this suffocating atmosphere, a private self persisted. In the quiet moments when she believed she was unobserved, small acts of autonomy surfaced. She hummed when no one listened. It was a melody that belonged only to her, a sound not meant for performance or approval. It was the sound of a mind finding a small hidden space to call its own. Her gaze, too, was her own. She looked toward gardens with locked gates. She saw a world of sunlight and nature, a world of freedom that was visible but inaccessible. The garden represented everything her life was not, natural, untamed, and free to grow. It was a potent symbol of a life she could imagine but could not reach. These small acts, the humming, the longing gaze, were symptoms of a deeper trait. Curiosity is a dangerous seed in a well-swept house. A well-swept house demands order, predictability. Curiosity asks questions. It challenges boundaries. It wonders what lies beyond the locked gate and why the key is on someone else's belt. In a girl bred for obedience, curiosity was a flaw, a crack in the polished facade. But you cannot command a seed not to grow. No matter how hard the ground, no matter how deep the shadow, life pushes toward the light. It still finds soil. Her mind, inquisitive and alive, found nourishment in stolen glances, whispered conversations, and the secret world of the household's other young inhabitants. In the unsupervised corners of the Duchess's home, this curiosity led to encounters. Here she learned another, more perilous lesson. Men called attention kindness, pressure romance, and power love. Her music tutor, Henry Mannix, offered flirtations and touches that blurred the line between teaching and grooming. Later, a gentleman of the household, Francis Derham, pursued her with a possessiveness she mistook for passion. In a world where she had no power, the focused attention of a man could feel like a form of validation, even as it was a form of predation. The concept of consent, as we understand it, did not exist. A woman's consent was her father's or guardian's to give. Her own yes or no was legally meaningless against the weight of social and familial pressure. These early relationships were not choices made in freedom, but events that happened to her in a context of profound power imbalance. Consent cannot bloom under a boot. It cannot grow in a garden with a locked gate. It requires a freedom Catherine had never been allowed to possess. These experiences, coercive and confusing, became part of her education. They were lessons in navigating the desires of men, in managing secrets, in surviving in a world that saw her as an object to be claimed. She learned to survive the lesson. She learned to compartmentalize, to perform the role required of her while guarding the small, secret flicker of her own self. But secrets have witnesses. In the crowded household, eyes were always watching, ears were always listening, and the ravens remembered. Every whispered promise, every clandestine meeting was a stone being stored, waiting to be thrown. For now, she was simply a girl on the cusp of womanhood, a valuable piece being moved into position on the board. Her family's ambition was about to propel her from the shadows of Lambeth into the blinding glare of the royal court. Her training was complete. Childhood closed like a door. The ink on the annulment from Anne of Cleves was barely dry. On July 28, 1540, at Oatlands Palace, the king took his fifth wife. The ceremony was private, almost hurried, a stark contrast to the grand public spectacles of his past unions. This was not a marriage of statecraft in the traditional sense, but one of personal desire, a king's desperate grasp for youth and vitality. A teenager married to a king old enough to be her grandfather. She was perhaps 19, he was 49, ailing, his body a roadmap of past glories and present pains. For Henry, she was a rose without a thorn, a symbol of renewal. For Catherine, she was a girl thrust onto the throne, a pawn in her family's relentless ambition. It was presented as honour. To be chosen by the king, to be elevated to Queen of England, was framed as the ultimate prize for any woman. The Howard faction, ascendant after the fall of Thomas Cromwell, celebrated their triumph. Publicly, the kingdom was encouraged to rejoice. Bells rang, and royal progresses were arranged to display the new, beautiful queen to the people. But amidst the orchestrated joy and the sea of bowing heads, Catherine's role was one of silent acquiescence. She was to be seen, admired, and possessed. Her own thoughts, her own fears had no place in the grand theatre of the court. Her face froze where her voice could not. The king showered her with gifts, jewels, fine fabrics, estates. Each present was a golden thread in the web binding her to him, a public declaration of his favour. To the court, these were signs of a love match, proof of her happiness and consent. Witnesses thought the gold meant consent. But the title of queen, this supposed honour, came with a heavy price. She was Henry's rose without a thorn, a dangerous ideal to embody. The court was a garden of beautiful flowers, but every stem had its own protection, its own secrets. Even roses have thorns hidden by ceremony. Her life became an exercise in accounting. Every gown, every jewel, every day of her existence was recorded, a transaction in the great ledger of the kingdom. The cost of her elevation was the erasure of her privacy. All debts were tallied. This was the reality behind the romance. It was a strategic merger, a consolidation of power for her family and a fulfillment of desire for the king. The room applauded a contract. The crown was heavy, a constant physical reminder of her duties and her confinement. It was a symbol of power, but not her own. It dictated where she went, whom she saw, and how she must behave. A crown is a gilded collar. Her world, though opulent, was a cage. The grand halls of Hampton Court and Whitehall were magnificent prisons, their beauty a constant reminder of the boundaries she could not cross. Palaces turned sunlight into stripes, and at the centre of this world was the king. His moods, dictated by his failing health and political anxieties, governed the atmosphere of the entire court. His presence demanded absolute deference. In his wake, no one breathed freely. Surrounded by ladies-in-waiting who were as much spies as companions, every word she spoke was noted. Every letter she might write a potential piece of evidence. Her inner world was the only space she truly owned, yet there was no safe harbour for it. She had thoughts and no parchment safe enough to hold them. The court continued its performance, a relentless pageant of happiness. They celebrated the king's joy, his youthful bride, the promise of a new heir. They cheered a fairy tale. But Catherine's existence was not a story, it was an inventory. A list of duties performed, gifts received, and expectations met. She lived a ledger. The entire court was a reflection of the king's will, a world shaped to please his eye and soothe his ego. Truth was a malleable commodity, easily reshaped to fit the narrative he desired. Power bends mirrors. In the quiet of the night, away from the watchful eyes and the suffocating ceremony, she could find brief moments of reprieve. The moon asked for nothing. It did not demand a smile or an air or a performance. In its silent silver light, she could simply be. She measured freedom by moonlight. Her real crime wasn't infidelity. Court gossip spreads faster than truth. Rumour is a blade passed hand to hand. It was independence. Freedom, heard by the wrong ears, becomes evidence. They recorded the sound of joy as a confession. She wanted choices, that was all. They called desire disloyalty. They called movement treason. They called pause a plan. Men did not fear betrayal. They feared a woman not owned. She tried to become smaller. She only became clearer. Independence is audible, even in silence. They accused her, investigated her body, judged her youth. Men wrote outcomes first, then they filled in names. She understood the theatre. Answers were props. She would not gift them her shaking. She looked at the piece of world still hers. Power prefers procedure. So it can say we had no choice. Choice was all they had. She stepped into their script and refused their ending, even as it came. The Tower of London, February 12th, 1542. The Bill of Attainder had passed. There would be no trial, no defence, only the final grim ceremony. For Catherine Howard, stripped of her title as Queen, the world had shrunk to the size of a single stone room, its air thick with the ghosts of those who came before. In these last hours, she made a final, unprecedented request. She asked to see the block. She practiced laying her head on the block the night before. A rehearsal for the end, a final attempt to command her own body when all else had been taken. Each movement was a deliberate study in composure, a quiet negotiation with the terror that threatened to consume her. This was not a plea for mercy. It was a ritual of acceptance, like a prayer with no amen. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the will to face the inevitable with one's eyes open. It is the quiet decision to not be broken even as you are destroyed. It is a hand that stops the flame from leaving. The next morning, Tower Green was cold and damp. The crowd was smaller, more select than for a public execution. This was a private affair for the court, a final lesson in obedience. She walked the short road that others had paved. Anne Boleyn, Margaret Pole, a path worn into the very ground by the tread of condemned women. Witnesses bring noise, few bring witness. They came to see a spectacle, to hear a confession, to feel the vicarious thrill of a queen's fall. They were there to record the event, but not to understand the life. But with each footfall on the hollow wood of the scaffold, she claimed her space in history. Every step said, "I was here." She spoke gently, as they required. The words were likely prepared for her, a script of contrition and acceptance of the king's justice. She confessed her sins, acknowledged her fate, and asked for prayers for the king. It was the expected performance, but her eyes were her truth. In that final gaze there was no plea, only a profound, unsettling calm. She forgave what she could. She forgave her ladies-in-waiting for their testimony, her family for their ambition, the men who had used her. Forgiveness not as absolution for them, but as a release for herself. She kept what they could not take, her memories, her sense of self forged in the fires of a brutal court. The knowledge of her own story, a narrative they had tried so desperately to rewrite and control. And in the end, she held on to the one thing that was truly hers from birth to death. Her name. The axe fell. The crowd gasped. And then a hush descended over Tower Green. In that quiet, the story they wanted to tell of a wanton queen justly punished began to unravel. Silence can be the loudest record. The men who condemned her called it morality. History, for a time, would call it justice. Power forgives men. It kills women. Remember her not for the ending they staged, but for the voice they feared. Say her name out loud. They weren't executed because they were weak. They were executed because they ruled. Queens, leaders, thinkers. History didn't forget them. History obeyed orders. This channel doesn't tell safe history. It tells the truth they tried to bury. Subscribe. Their stories were never finished.